Brenda Thompson, the self-proclaimed guardian of suburban tranquility, was a force to be reckoned with in the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. To call her detail-oriented would be a gross understatement. Brenda possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot the slightest deviation from the HOA's meticulously crafted bylaws: that a misplaced garden gnome, a slightly faded mailbox, a rogue dandelion daring to sprout in a perfectly manicured lawn. All were offenses punishable by Brenda's unwavering scrutiny and, of course, a passive-aggressive notice slipped under the offender's door. Her current obsession, however, was David Miller, her next-door neighbor. David, a software engineer with a penchant for Hawaiian shirts and a relaxed attitude toward lawn care, was Brenda's nemesis. Their feud had been simmering for months, fueled by what Brenda considered David's blatant disregard for the HOA's landscaping regulations. It started innocently enough, with Brenda politely pointing out that David's grass was half an inch longer than the permissible height. David, in his amiable way, had chuckled and promised to get to it sometime soon. But sometime soon turned into a week, then two, and Brenda's polite requests morphed into increasingly terse emails, copies of which were, naturally, sent to the entire HOA board. The grass, she argued, was a breeding ground for unsightly weeds and a disgrace to the neighborhood. Then came the incident with the petunias. David, in a rare burst of gardening enthusiasm, had planted a row of vibrant purple petunias along his walkway. Brenda, armed with the HOA's approved plant list, immediately pounced. Petunias, she declared, were not on the approved list, and furthermore, purple was an unharmonious color that clashed with the neighborhood's carefully curated aesthetic. David, exasperated but still trying to keep the peace, reluctantly agreed to replace the offending petunias with something more beige. But the damage was done. The tension between them had reached a boiling point. Brenda saw David as a rebellious scofflaw, a threat to the very fabric of Willow Creek Estates. David saw Brenda as a petty tyrant, a woman whose life was so devoid of meaning that she had to micromanage the length of his grass to feel important. Little did he know, Brenda's obsessive tendencies were about to escalate far beyond passive-aggressive emails and disapproving glares. She was about to take their feud to a whole new level of crazy. David Miller, on the other hand, was the antithesis of Brenda's rigid perfectionism. A man who found joy in coding, craft beer, and the occasional weekend camping trip. David viewed the HOA regulations as more of a suggestion than a commandment. He genuinely tried to be a good neighbor, but Brenda's standards were, in his opinion, impossibly high. He simply didn't have the time or the inclination to obsess over the precise shade of green in his lawn or the alignment of his garden post. He'd initially tried to appease Brenda, figuring a little compromise could keep the peace. After the grass incident, he dutifully mowed his lawn, even investing in a fancy new lawnmower with adjustable height settings. He thought he'd finally met her expectations, until Brenda sent him another email, this time complaining about the unevenness of the cut. Apparently, he'd missed a few blades of grass near the edge of the sidewalk. David resisted the urge to roll his eyes and instead spent the next hour meticulously trimming the edges with a pair of scissors, just to shut her up. The petunia debacle was even more frustrating. He genuinely thought the vibrant purple flowers would brighten up the neighborhood. He hadn't even considered checking the HOA's approved plant list. When Brenda confronted him, he'd offered to replace them with impatiens, a safe and boring choice that he knew would meet her approval. But Brenda wasn't satisfied. She insisted that he remove the petunias immediately and properly dispose of them, lest their unharmonious purple contaminate the soil. David, gritting his teeth, had spent the next evening digging up the petunias and replanting the area with dull, white impatiens. He even added a layer of mulch, just to be extra compliant. He thought he'd finally earned a reprieve, but Brenda's complaints continued, albeit subtly. She started leaving anonymous notes on his car, criticizing his parking skills. She complained about the noise level of his weekend barbecues, even though he always kept the music at a reasonable volume. She even accused him of attracting squirrels to the neighborhood with his bird feeder, a claim that David found particularly absurd. Despite Brenda's constant nagging, David tried to maintain a positive attitude. He knew that arguing with her was pointless. She was simply incapable of seeing things from his perspective. He hoped that eventually, She would tire of her petty crusade and find someone else to harass. But Brenda was relentless, and David was running out of patience. He knew that sooner or later, something would have to give. He just didn't realize that something would involve a hijacked garbage truck and a mountain of trash. The final straw, the landscaping infraction that shattered Brenda's already tenuous grip on reality, involved David's newly planted rose bushes. After the petunia fiasco, David, in a moment of defiant optimism, had decided to try his hand at roses. He'd chosen a variety called knockout roses, known for their hardiness and disease resistance. He figured they were a safe bet, a universally admired flower that even Brenda couldn't find fault with. He was wrong. Brenda, during her daily patrol of the neighborhood, noticed the roses immediately. They were a vibrant shade of red, a color she considered garish and incompatible with the neighborhood's overall color scheme. But it wasn't just the color that offended her. It was the fact that David had planted them without submitting a formal landscaping proposal to the HOA for approval. He hadn't even bothered to consult the approved plant list, a document Brenda had practically memorized. She fired off a scathing email to David, accusing him of willful disregard for HOA regulations and demanding that he remove the roses immediately. She even included a detailed diagram illustrating how the roses violated the HOA's aesthetic guidelines, complete with color-coded arrows and highlighted passages from the bylaws. David, upon reading the email, felt a surge of anger he hadn't experienced before. He'd tried to be reasonable, he'd tried to compromise, but Brenda's relentless pettiness had finally pushed him over the edge. He considered ignoring her email, but he knew that wouldn't be the end of it. Brenda would escalate. She would involve the HOA board, and he would eventually be forced to remove the roses. Anyway, he briefly contemplated planting even more roses, just to spite her, but he knew that would only make things worse. Instead, he decided to take a different approach. He sent Brenda a polite but firm email, explaining that he was aware of the HOA regulations and that he would submit a landscaping proposal as soon as possible. He even offered to meet with her to discuss the matter further. Brenda, however, was not interested in compromise. She saw David's email as a sign of weakness, a tacit admission of guilt. She was convinced that he was deliberately flouting the HOA rules and that he needed to be taught a lesson. That's when the idea, the truly insane idea, began to form in her mind. It started as a fleeting thought, a momentary flash of anger, but it quickly took root and blossomed into a full-blown plan. She would show David what it meant to disrespect the HOA. She would teach him a lesson he would never forget. She would hijack a garbage truck and dump its contents all over his perfectly manicured lawn. Brenda's plan, hatched in the feverish heat of righteous indignation, was nothing short of ludicrous. It was a plan so elaborate, so meticulously detailed, and so utterly insane that it could only have been conceived by someone who had completely lost touch with reality. First, she needed to determine the garbage truck's route. For weeks, Brenda had been meticulously tracking the waste management truck as it wound its way through Willow Creek Estates. She charted its course, noting the exact times it arrived at each house and the duration of each stop. She even created a spreadsheet, complete with color-coded cells, to optimize her hijacking strategy. Next, she needed a disguise. She couldn't very well waltz up to the garbage truck in her usual attire of sensible slacks and a floral blouse. She needed something that would blend in, something that would make her look like she belonged. After scouring the internet, she settled on a reflective safety vest and a pair of oversized sunglasses. She even considered purchasing a fake mustache, but ultimately decided against it, fearing it would look too suspicious. Then came the most challenging part, figuring out how to actually hijack the truck. Brenda wasn't exactly a master criminal. Her experience with law-breaking was limited to exceeding the speed limit on the highway and occasionally sneaking extra cookies from the office break room. She knew she couldn't overpower the driver with brute force. She needed a more subtle approach. She considered feigning a medical emergency, hoping to distract the driver long enough to slip behind the wheel. She even thought about planting a fake bomb scare, but quickly dismissed the idea as being too risky. Finally, she settled on a plan that was both simple and audacious. She would pretend to be a waste management employee herself. She would approach the driver, flashing her reflective vest and sunglasses, and claim that she was there to relieve him for his lunch break. She would need to memorize some industry jargon, practice her authoritative tone, and hoped that the driver was gullible enough to fall for her charade. Brenda spent hours rehearsing her lines, practicing her walk, and perfecting her menacing glare. She even downloaded a waste management training manual and studied it cover to cover, memorizing facts about garbage truck maintenance and waste disposal regulations. The absurdity of it all was lost on her. She was so consumed by her desire for revenge that she had completely lost sight of the fact that she was planning to commit a serious crime that in her mind, she wasn't a criminal. She was a crusader, a defender of suburban order, a champion of the HOA, and David Miller, with his unapproved roses and his unkempt lawn, was the enemy. The day of the hijacking dawned bright and sunny, a stark contrast to the dark intentions brewing in Brenda's heart. Armed with her reflective vest, oversized sunglasses, and a laminated waste management ID card she'd printed herself, complete with a slightly blurry photo, Brenda set out to intercept the garbage truck. She positioned herself strategically near the Willow Creek Estate's entrance, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. As the familiar rumble of the garbage truck grew louder, Brenda took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. This was it. Time to put her meticulously crafted plan into action. The truck pulled to a stop at the curb, and the driver, a burly man named Gary with a handlebar mustache and a weary expression, hopped out to empty the trash cans. Brenda seized her opportunity. She marched purposefully towards Gary, flashing her fake ID card with a practiced flick of the wrist. "Morning, Gary," she said, adopting her most authoritative tone. "I'm here to relieve you for your lunch break. Corporate sent me. Something about mandatory overtime compliance." Gary, squinting in the sunlight, looked at Brenda with suspicion. "Lunch break? But I just started my route." Brenda pressed on, rattling off some memorized waste management jargon. "Yeah, well, corporate doesn't care about your route, Gary. They care about those overtime hours. Just hand over the keys and clock out. I'll take it from here." Gary hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure. He'd never seen Brenda before, and something about her demeanor seemed a little off. But he was also tired, and the prospect of an early lunch was tempting. "You sure about this?" he asked, scratching his head. Brenda nodded firmly. "Absolutely. Just follow protocol, Gary. Don't make this difficult." With a shrug, Gary handed over the keys to the garbage truck. "All right, lady," he said, "but if I get in trouble for this, I'm blaming you." Brenda smiled, a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Don't worry, Gary. Everything's under control." As Gary walked away, Brenda climbed into the driver's seat of the garbage truck, feeling a surge of exhilaration. She had done it. She had successfully hijacked a garbage truck. Now, all that was left was to deliver her special gift to David Miller. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Justice, she told herself, would soon be served. With Gary safely out of the picture, Brenda revved the engine of the garbage truck and steered it towards David's house. A grim satisfaction washed over her as she pictured his face when he saw what she had in store for him. As she pulled up to David's curb, she surveyed his pristine lawn, the very picture of suburban perfection, and a wicked smile crept across her face. She positioned the truck carefully, ensuring that the rear end was facing directly towards David's meticulously manicured flower beds. Then, with a flick of a switch, she activated the truck's hydraulic lift. The back of the truck began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, until it was tilted at a precarious angle. The contents of the garbage truck, a veritable mountain of refuse collected from the unsuspecting residents of Willow Creek Estates, began to spill out. Bags of trash, overflowing with discarded food wrappers, crumpled newspapers, and unwanted junk mail, cascaded down onto David's lawn in a stinking avalanche. Old coffee grounds, banana peels, and half-eaten leftovers splattered against his carefully trimmed hedges. Broken toys, discarded appliances, and other assorted debris rained down upon his prized knockout roses, burying them beneath a suffocating layer of garbage. The sheer volume of trash was staggering. That it covered every inch of David's lawn, transforming his suburban paradise into a grotesque landfill. The stench was overwhelming, a nauseating mix of rotting food and decaying waste. Brenda watched with a perverse sense of satisfaction as the garbage piled higher and higher, completely obliterating David's landscaping. She imagined David's horror when he discovered the mess, his outrage at her audacious act of revenge. She pictured him scrambling to clean up the garbage, his hands covered in filth, his clothes stained with grime. The thought filled her with a sense of vindication. He had disrespected the HOA, and now he was paying the price. The entire spectacle took only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Brenda as the last of the garbage slid out of the truck. She lowered the hydraulic lift and put the vehicle into gear. She glanced back at David's lawn, now completely unrecognizable beneath the mountain of trash, and a smug smile spread across her face. Justice, she thought, had finally been served. With a final flourish, she drove the garbage truck away, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The audacity of her actions was breathtaking, a testament to the depths of her obsession and the extent of her delusion. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. David had been looking forward to a relaxing Saturday morning. He'd planned to brew a pot of his favorite Kona coffee, catch up on some coding projects, and maybe even fire up the grill for a late afternoon barbecue. As he opened his front door, ready to retrieve the morning newspaper, he was immediately assaulted by an overwhelming stench. At first, he thought there must be something wrong with his garbage can. Perhaps an animal had gotten into it overnight, scattering the contents across his yard. But as he stepped outside, he realized the situation was far worse than he could have ever imagined. His jaw dropped in disbelief. His eyes widened in shock. His pristine lawn, the lawn he had painstakingly maintained, mostly to appease Brenda, was completely covered in a mountain of garbage. Bags of trash, overflowing with refuse, were piled high against his house, his hedges, and his beloved knockout roses. The air was thick with the smell of rotting food and decaying waste. It was a scene of utter devastation, a grotesque parody of suburban tranquility. For a moment, David stood frozen, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Had he stumbled into some kind of bizarre alternate reality? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? As the initial shock wore off, a wave of anger washed over him. This wasn't just a prank. This was a deliberate act of vandalism, a malicious attack on his property. Someone had gone to great lengths to create this mess, and David was determined to find out who was responsible. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He would not let this go unpunished. He surveyed the scene, looking for any clues that might reveal the identity of the perpetrator. He noticed tire tracks in his lawn, leading away from the curb. They were large and heavy, consistent with those of a garbage truck. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Someone had actually used a garbage truck to dump this mess on his lawn. The sheer audacity of it was almost comical. But David wasn't laughing. He was furious. He was determined to find out who would do such a thing, and he was going to make them pay. That he started by checking his security cameras. He had installed 5 cameras around his house a few months ago, mostly to deter burglars. He'd never actually needed to use them before, but now they might be his only hope of catching the culprit. With renewed determination, David turned and headed back inside, ready to review the security footage and unravel the mystery of the garbage-strewn lawn. Inside his house, David navigated to the security system interface on his computer. The 5 camera feeds flickered on the screen, each offering a different perspective of his property. He rewound the footage to the early morning hours, the time he suspected the garbage dumping had occurred. The first camera, positioned above his front door, showed nothing but an empty street. He skipped ahead an hour. Then another, still nothing. His frustration grew. He hoped the other cameras had captured something. The second camera, overlooking his driveway, offered a slightly different angle. As he scanned through the footage, he noticed a flicker of movement in the distance. He zoomed in, his heart pounding with anticipation. A large vehicle, vaguely resembling a garbage truck, appeared in the frame. It was still too far away to make out any details, but David's hopes surged. He switched to the third camera, located on the side of his house, which provided a clearer view of the street. This time, he didn't have to wait long. A garbage truck, unmistakable in its size and shape, lumbered into view. David leaned closer to the screen, his eyes glued to the footage. He watched as the truck pulled up to his curb and stopped directly in front of his lawn. He could see someone getting out of the driver's seat, but their face was obscured by the shadows. He switched to the fourth camera, positioned in his backyard, hoping for a better view. This camera offered a panoramic view of his entire backyard. including his lawn and flower beds. As he scanned through the footage, he saw the garbage truck backing up towards his property. Then, with a loud hydraulic hiss, the back of the truck began to rise. David's breath caught in his throat. He knew what was coming. He watched in disbelief as the garbage truck unloaded its contents onto his lawn, creating a massive pile of refuse that completely obliterated his landscaping. The footage was grainy and distorted, but he could still make out the general shape and size of the person operating the truck. It was definitely an adult, but their features were still too blurry to identify. Finally, he switched to the fifth camera, which was positioned directly above his garage door. This camera offered the clearest view of the street and anyone approaching his property. David held his breath as he scanned through the footage, his fingers crossed. This was his last chance to identify the culprit. As the garbage truck pulled up to his curb, David zoomed in on the driver's seat. The image was still slightly blurry, but he could make out the distinct outline of a person wearing a reflective safety vest and oversized sunglasses. Then, as the driver turned their head slightly towards the camera, David's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. David stared at the screen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The woman in the reflective vest and oversized sunglasses, the woman behind the wheel of the garbage truck, the woman responsible for the mountain of trash on his lawn. It was Brenda Thompson, his next-door neighbor, the self-appointed guardian of Willow Creek Estates, the HOA. Karen extraordinaire. A wave of shock washed over him, followed by a surge of disbelief. He replayed the footage several times, zooming in on Brenda's face, scrutinizing her every move. There was no mistaking it was her. He couldn't believe it. Of all the people he suspected, Brenda was the last person he would have imagined capable of such an outrageous act. He knew she was obsessed with the HOA rules. He knew she could be petty and annoying, but he never thought she would resort to something so extreme, so insane. As the initial shock subsided, a strange mixture of emotions began to bubble up inside him. There was anger, of course, at the sheer audacity of her actions, at the blatant disregard for his property, at the sheer mess he was now faced with cleaning up. But there was also a touch of betrayal. He had tried to be a good neighbor. He had tried to appease her. He had even replaced his beloved purple petunias with boring white impatiens just to keep her happy. And this was how she repaid him. But beneath the anger and betrayal, there was also a flicker of amusement. The sheer ridiculousness of the situation was almost comical. Brenda Thompson, hijacking a garbage truck and dumping trash on his lawn. It was the kind of thing you'd see in a movie, not in real life. He couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. He replayed the footage again, this time focusing on Brenda's demeanor as she operated the garbage truck. She looked so serious, so determined, so completely convinced that she was doing the right thing. It was almost endearing. In a twisted sort of way, he imagined her meticulously planning the hijacking, studying the waste management training manual, practicing her authoritative tone. The thought made him laugh out loud. But the laughter quickly faded, replaced by a sense of resolve. This wasn't just a funny story to tell his friends. This was a serious crime, and Brenda needed to be held accountable for her actions. He couldn't let her get away with that he knew he had to call the police. He knew he had to press charges. He knew he had to do everything in his power to ensure that Brenda Thompson paid for what she had done. The only question was, how would he explain this to the authorities? How would he convince them that his HOA Karen neighbor had actually hijacked a garbage truck and dumped trash on his lawn? It sounded too crazy to be true. But he had the evidence. He had the security footage, and he was ready to use it. Dialing 911, David braced himself for the inevitable skepticism. How do you explain to a police dispatcher that your neighbor, an HOA zealot, hijacked a garbage truck and used it to trash your yard? He took a deep breath and began. I need to report a crime, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. My neighbor, she dumped a whole garbage truck full of trash on my lawn. The dispatcher, a woman with a weary voice, paused for a moment. Okay, sir, can you repeat that? You're saying someone dumped garbage on your lawn? Yes, David replied. A whole garbage truck full, and I have security footage of it happening. He explained the situation as calmly and rationally as he could, trying to downplay the absurdity of it all. That he mentioned Brenda's name, her obsession with the HOA, and the long-standing feud over landscaping. The dispatcher, after a long silence, assured him that officers would be dispatched to his location. David hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had done what he thought was right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to be the subject of ridicule. It wasn't long before two police officers arrived at his house, sirens blaring and lights flashing. They stepped out of their patrol car, looking serious and professional. David met them at the curb, trying to maintain a composed demeanor. "Officers," he said, "thank you for coming. You're not going to believe this." He gestured towards his lawn, now a sprawling wasteland of trash and debris. The officers stared in disbelief, their mouths agape. One of them, a young officer named Miller, let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said, "I've seen some crazy things in my career, but this takes the cake." David led them inside and showed them the security footage. As they watched Brenda hijack the garbage truck and dump its contents onto his lawn, their expressions shifted from disbelief to amusement. Officer Miller couldn't help but chuckle. This is unbelievable," he said, shaking his head. "Your neighbor actually hijacked a garbage truck?" The other officer, a more seasoned veteran named Johnson, tried to maintain a straight face, but even he couldn't suppress a smile. "Okay, sir," he said to David, "we're going to need to take a statement, and we're going to need to talk to your neighbor." As they stepped back outside to assess the scene, Officer Johnson shook his head in amazement. "I've never seen anything like this before," he muttered. "An HOA dispute gone completely off the rails." David couldn't help but smile. He knew the situation was serious, but there was something undeniably comical about the whole thing. He had been the victim of an incredibly bizarre crime, and his HOA Karen neighbor was about to face the consequences. With the security footage in hand, Officers Miller and Johnson approached Brenda's house. They knocked on the door, and Brenda, looking flustered and slightly disheveled, answered. "Yes, officers. Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Officer Johnson, trying to maintain a professional demeanor, informed her that they were investigating a report of vandalism and grand theft involving a garbage truck. That Brenda's eyes widened in feigned innocence. "A garbage truck? Vandalism? I have no idea what you're talking about." Officer Miller, unable to resist a smirk, pulled out his phone and showed her a still image from David's security footage. It was a clear shot of Brenda, wearing her reflective vest and sunglasses, behind the wheel of the garbage truck. Brenda's face flushed crimson. She stammered, trying to find an explanation. That's not me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a deep fake. Someone is trying to frame me." Officer Johnson raised an eyebrow. "A deep fake? Ma'am, we have 5 security cameras capturing this incident from multiple angles, and frankly, it's pretty clear that's you." Brenda's denial quickly crumbled, replaced by a defiant indignation. "Fine," she snapped. "So it was me. So what? He deserved it. He was violating the HOA regulations. His roses were an abomination. Someone had to do something." Officer Miller and Johnson exchanged glances. This was even crazier than they had initially thought. They placed Brenda under arrest, informing her of her rights. She protested vehemently, insisting that she was the victim, not the perpetrator. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood," she cried. "He was destroying our property values. I was doing what anyone would have done in my situation." As they led her to the patrol car, Brenda continued to rant about David's landscaping infractions and the importance of upholding the HOA regulations. Her neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered on the street, watching in stunned silence as Brenda was placed in the back of the police car. Some of them whispered amongst themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Others snickered, finding a morbid amusement in the spectacle. As the patrol car pulled away, Brenda leaned out the window and shouted, "You'll all thank me later. I was doing this for you." In the back of the police car, Brenda's initial defiance began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was facing serious charges, including grand theft and illegal dumping. She could go to jail. Her reputation was ruined. Her life was spiraling out of control. But even as fear gripped her, a small part of her still believed that she had done the right thing. She had stood up for what she believed in. She had defended the HOA. And in her mind, that made it all worthwhile. That Brenda's arrest marked the beginning of a long and arduous legal battle. The district attorney, initially amused by the sheer absurdity of the case, quickly realized that Brenda's actions constituted serious crimes. She was formally charged with 2 felonies: grand theft auto for the hijacking of the garbage truck and illegal dumping, given the environmental hazard and cost associated with cleaning up David's lawn. The grand theft auto charge carried a potential sentence of up to 5 years in prison, depending on the value of the garbage truck and Brenda's prior criminal record, which, thankfully for her, was non-existent. The illegal dumping charge also carried a significant penalty, including hefty fines and potential jail time, particularly given the scale of the dumping and the fact that it involved hazardous waste. Brenda, now facing the full weight of the legal system, hired a lawyer, a seasoned criminal defense attorney named Ms. Stern. Ms. Stern, known for her sharp wit and aggressive tactics, recognized that Brenda's case was an uphill battle. The security footage was damning, and Brenda's initial denial only made things worse. Ms. Stern advised Brenda to plead not guilty and explore all possible defenses. She considered arguing temporary insanity, claiming that Brenda was suffering from a mental breakdown brought on by the stress of HOA regulations. She also considered arguing diminished capacity, claiming that Brenda's judgment was impaired by her obsessive personality and her long-standing feud with David. However, after reviewing the security footage and interviewing Brenda, Ms. Stern realized that neither of those defenses was likely to succeed. Brenda, while clearly eccentric and perhaps a little unhinged, was not legally insane, and her actions, while extreme, were clearly premeditated and deliberate. Ms. Stern decided to focus on mitigating the damages and negotiating a plea bargain with the district attorney. She argued that Brenda was a first-time offender, that she had a history of community involvement, albeit mostly through the HOA, and that she was genuinely remorseful for her actions, although Brenda's definition of remorseful was somewhat questionable. She also pointed out that David's lawn had been fully cleaned up at Brenda's expense, and that Brenda had agreed to undergo anger management counseling. The district attorney, while sympathetic to David's plight, also recognized that Brenda's case was a drain on resources. That he agreed to consider a plea bargain that would reduce the charges and minimize the potential penalties. The legal proceedings dragged on. Brenda's life continued to unravel. She was ostracized by her neighbors, who whispered about her behind her back and avoided her at all costs. She was suspended from her position on the HOA board, and her reputation was in tatters. She had become a pariah, a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of what can happen when HOA obsession goes too far. The news of Brenda's garbage truck escapade spread through Willow Creek estates like wildfire. The HOA's email list, usually reserved for announcements about lawn care and holiday decorations, was flooded with messages expressing shock, outrage, and disbelief. The incident became the talk of the neighborhood, dominating conversations at the mailbox, the community pool, and even the weekly book club meeting. The reactions were varied. Some residents, particularly those who had been on the receiving end of Brenda's meticulous scrutiny, felt a sense of schadenfreude. They secretly rejoiced in her downfall, viewing it as a karmic payback for her years of petty tyranny. They whispered about her behind her back, sharing knowing glances and suppressed giggles. Others, particularly the more conservative and rule-abiding members of the HOA, were appalled by Brenda's actions. They saw her as an embarrassment to the community, a stain on their reputation, and a threat to their property values. They demanded that she be stripped of her HOA membership and banished from Willow Creek Estates forever. Few residents, however, felt a strange sense of sympathy for Brenda. They recognized that her actions, while extreme, stemmed from a genuine desire to protect the neighborhood and uphold the HOA regulations. They saw her as a misguided idealist, a woman who had simply taken things too far. The incident had a profound impact on the neighborhood dynamic. The already strained relationships between neighbors became even more tense. People were afraid to speak their minds, fearing that they might become the next target of someone's misguided sense of justice. The HOA meetings became battlegrounds, with residents arguing fiercely over everything from landscaping guidelines to parking regulations. The HOA board, desperate to restore order and quell the unrest, implemented a series of reforms. They revised the landscaping guidelines, making them more flexible and less restrictive. They established a mediation program to help resolve disputes between neighbors, and they created a community outreach program to promote communication and understanding. But the damage was done. The trust between neighbors had been broken. The sense of community had been shattered. Willow Creek Estates, once a haven of suburban tranquility, had become a hotbed of suspicion, resentment, and fear. The garbage truck incident had exposed the dark underbelly of HOA life, revealing the potential for pettiness, obsession, and even violence to fester beneath the surface of perfectly manicured lawns and meticulously painted mailboxes. The residents of Willow Creek Estates would never look at their HOA or their neighbors the same way again. Despite Ms. Stern's efforts to negotiate a plea bargain, Brenda remained convinced that she was in the right. She insisted on taking her case to trial, determined to prove her innocence, or at least to justify her actions in the eyes of the LAW.as. The trial began. Brenda took center stage, eager to share her version of events with the jury. Her defense strategy was a bizarre combination of temporary insanity and victim blaming. She claimed that she had been driven to the brink by David's constant disregard for the HOA regulations, arguing that his actions had caused her severe emotional distress. She portrayed herself as a selfless defender of suburban order, a woman who had sacrificed everything to protect her community from the scourge of unapproved landscaping. "I was just trying to uphold the rules," she exclaimed, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. "He was destroying our property values. He was creating a nuisance. He was a menace to society." Ms. Stern cringed, knowing that Brenda's histrionics were doing more harm than good. But Brenda was unstoppable, lost in her own delusional world. She described in excruciating detail the various landscaping infractions that David had committed, from the length of his grass to the color of his petunias. She presented the jury with charts, diagrams, and photographs, meticulously documenting each and every violation. She even brought in a copy of the HOA regulations, highlighting the passages that she claimed David had violated. She argued that David's red rose bushes were not only aesthetically offensive, but also a threat to the local ecosystem, claiming that they attracted invasive insects and disrupted the delicate balance of nature. She insisted that his unkempt lawn was a breeding ground for disease and a haven for vermin. She even accused him of deliberately provoking her, arguing that he knew his actions were upsetting her and that he was doing it on purpose. The prosecution, of course, had a field day with Brenda's testimony. They pointed out that her actions were completely disproportionate to the alleged offenses, and that there was no justification for hijacking a garbage truck and dumping trash on someone's lawn. They presented the security footage as irrefutable evidence of her guilt, highlighting the premeditation and the deliberate nature of her actions. The prosecutor even brought in Gary, the garbage truck driver, who testified about how Brenda had tricked him into handing over the keys. Gary described Brenda's disguise, her authoritative tone, and her memorized waste management jargon. The jury couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. As Brenda's defense crumbled around her, she became increasingly desperate. She began to ramble, ranting about the importance of following rules, the dangers of nonconformity, and the need to protect society from the forces of chaos. She even claimed that David was part of a secret conspiracy to undermine the HOA and destroy the fabric of suburban life. The judge, growing increasingly exasperated, repeatedly ordered her to stick to the facts. But Brenda was beyond reason, lost in her own world of HOA-fueled paranoia. The climax of the trial arrived with the presentation of the security footage. The prosecutor, with a theatrical flourish, played the footage for the jury, showing Brenda's meticulous planning, her successful hijacking of the garbage truck, and her triumphant dumping of the contents onto David's lawn. The footage was played in slow motion, with close-ups of Brenda's face, highlighting her expression of grim satisfaction as she carried out her act of revenge. The courtroom was silent as the jury watched the footage, their faces a mixture of shock, amusement, and disbelief. Even Ms. Stern, Brenda's lawyer, couldn't help but cringe at the sight of her client's unhinged behavior. The security footage was the nail in the coffin, the final piece of evidence that sealed Brenda's fate. After the presentation of the evidence, the judge instructed the jury to begin their deliberations. The jury filed out of the courtroom, leaving Brenda to await her fate. The hours that followed were agonizing. Brenda sat at the defense table, fidgeting nervously, her eyes darting around the room. She whispered to Ms. Stern, asking repeatedly if she thought the jury would find her guilty. Ms. Stern, trying to remain optimistic, offered words of encouragement, but she knew that the odds were stacked against them. The evidence was overwhelming, and Brenda's behavior in court had only made things worse. David, who had been present throughout the trial, sat quietly in the gallery, watching Brenda with a mixture of pity and disdain that he had never wanted things to come to this. But he knew that Brenda had to be held accountable for her actions. As the hours passed, the tension in the courtroom grew palpable. The reporters covering the trial buzzed with anticipation, speculating on the potential verdict. The spectators whispered amongst themselves, debating Brenda's guilt or innocence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury sent a message to the judge. They had reached a verdict. That a hush fell over the courtroom as the jury filed back into their seats. Brenda held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The judge asked the foreperson of the jury to read the verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, stood up and cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brenda Thompson, guilty of grand theft auto," she said, her voice clear and unwavering that a gasp rippled through the courtroom. Brenda slumped in her chair, her face pale and drawn. The foreperson continued, "We, the jury, also find the defendant, Brenda Thompson, guilty of illegal dumping." A collective sigh swept through the courtroom. Brenda Thompson, the HOA Karen who had hijacked a garbage truck and dumped trash on her neighbor's lawn, was guilty on all counts. Brenda's face crumpled as the verdict was read. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she began to sob uncontrollably. Ms. Stern put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but Brenda shrugged it off, her body racked with grief and despair. She couldn't believe it. She had truly believed that she would be vindicated, that the jury would see her as a hero, a champion of suburban order. But instead, she was a convicted felon, facing the prospect of prison time. The judge, a stern-faced woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, called Brenda to stand before her for sentencing. Brenda, her eyes red and swollen, approached the bench with a shuffling gait. The judge looked down at her with a mixture of disappointment and disapproval. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice firm but measured, "your actions were not only illegal, but also reckless and irresponsible. You took the law into your own hands, and you caused significant damage to Mr. Miller's property and to the community as a whole." The judge acknowledged Brenda's lack of prior criminal record and her history of community involvement, but she also emphasized the seriousness of the crimes and the need to deter others from engaging in similar behavior. Therefore, the judge declared, "I sentence you to 5 years of probation. You will also be required to perform 500 hours of community service, undergo anger management counseling, and pay restitution to Mr. Miller for the cost of cleaning up his property." Brenda gasped, her face contorted with anger and disbelief. "That's not fair," she cried. "I didn't do anything wrong. He deserved it." The judge, unmoved by Brenda's outburst, banged her gavel. "Ms. Thompson," she said, "if you violate the terms of your probation, you will be sent to prison. Do you understand?" Brenda, defeated and humiliated, mumbled a barely audible yes. As she was led out of the courtroom, she glared at David, her eyes filled with hatred and resentment. David, watching Brenda's departure, felt a twinge of guilt. He had never wanted her to go to prison. He had simply wanted her to understand the consequences of her actions. He had hoped that the legal proceedings would serve as a wake-up call, a chance for her to realize the error of her ways. But it was clear that Brenda was still in denial, still convinced that she was in the right. That as he left the courtroom, David couldn't help but wonder what the future held for Brenda. Would she ever be able to overcome her obsession with the HOA and find a way to live peacefully in the community? Or would she continue to be a source of conflict and chaos, a cautionary tale of what can happen when good intentions go terribly wrong? Only time would tell. The aftermath of the trial was brutal for Brenda. She returned to Willow Creek Estates a pariah, her reputation in tatters. The whispers and stares followed her everywhere she went. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, and children pointed and giggled as she walked by. The social isolation was crushing. The HOA, eager to distance themselves from her, formally revoked her membership and banned her from attending any future meetings or events. They even sent her a cease and desist letter, forbidding her from contacting any of the other residents. Brenda, once the self-proclaimed guardian of Willow Creek Estates, was now an outcast, banished from the very community she had tried so hard to protect. Her days were filled with loneliness and regret. She spent hours staring out the window, watching her neighbors go about their lives, wondering what they were saying about her. She tried to find solace in her garden, but even her beloved flowers seemed to mock her, their vibrant colors a reminder of her own faded glory. The anger management counseling was a humiliating experience. She was forced to sit in a room with other problem individuals, listening to their tales of violence, addiction, and abuse. She couldn't relate to any of them. She saw herself as a victim, not a perpetrator. She had simply been trying to do what was right, to uphold the rules, to protect her community. The community service was equally degrading. She was assigned to clean up trash along the highway, picking up discarded fast food wrappers and empty beer cans under the scorching sun. The irony was not lost on her. She, the woman who had been so obsessed with cleanliness and order, was now forced to wallow in filth and squalor. Even her own family seemed to have turned against her. Her husband, embarrassed by her actions, had moved into the guest room. Her children, ashamed of her notoriety, rarely visited. Brenda was alone, isolated, and utterly miserable. The consequences of her actions had far exceeded anything she could have imagined. She had lost her reputation, her friends, her family, and her place in the community. She had become a cautionary tale, a living example of what can happen when good intentions go terribly wrong. As she sat alone in her empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of her former life, Brenda couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. Had her obsession with the HOA really been worth sacrificing everything she held dear? The answer, she knew, was a resounding and heartbreaking no. While Brenda's life spiraled downward, David focused on rebuilding his own. The initial task of cleaning up the mountain of garbage was daunting, but he was determined to restore his property to its former glory. He hired a professional cleaning crew to haul away the trash and decontaminate his lawn, a process that took several days and cost a small fortune, though Brenda was eventually ordered to pay restitution. Once the garbage was gone, David faced the challenge of restoring his landscaping. His lawn was a disaster, his flower beds were ruined, and his beloved knockout roses were buried beneath a layer of grime. He spent weeks tilling the soil, planting new grass seed, and replanting his flower beds. He decided to take a different approach this time. Choosing plants that were both aesthetically pleasing and easy to maintain, he replaced the knockout roses with a variety of drought-resistant shrubs and colorful perennials that required minimal care. He even added a small vegetable garden, growing tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. As he worked on his yard, David found a sense of peace and fulfillment. He realized that he had been so focused on appeasing Brenda that he had neglected his own happiness. He had allowed her petty complaints and impossible standards to dictate how he lived his life. Now, he was free to create a yard that reflected his own personality and preferences. That he no longer cared about what the HOA thought or what Brenda thought. He was simply enjoying the process of creating a beautiful and relaxing space for himself. He also made an effort to reconnect with his neighbors, inviting them over for barbecues and potlucks. He wanted to rebuild the sense of community that had been shattered by Brenda's actions. He wanted to show his neighbors that he wasn't holding any grudges, that he was willing to move on and start fresh. Slowly but surely, David began to heal. He learned to let go of his anger and resentment towards Brenda, realizing that holding onto those negative emotions was only hurting himself. He forgave her, not because she deserved it, but because he needed to move on. He also learned a valuable lesson about the importance of standing up for himself and not allowing others to dictate how he lived his life. That he realized that it was okay to disagree with the HOA, to challenge their rules, and to express his own opinions. That he no longer felt the need to appease everyone, to conform to their expectations. He was free to be himself, to live his life on his own terms. As David looked out at his newly restored yard, he felt a sense of accomplishment and peace. He had overcome a difficult challenge, and he had emerged stronger and wiser. He had learned to let go of the past and embrace the future. He had found a way to move on from the garbage truck incident, and he was ready to live his life to the fullest. The garbage truck incident left a lasting mark on Willow Creek Estates. The HOA, once a symbol of suburban order and conformity, became a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of what can happen when good intentions go too far. The incident sparked a community-wide debate about the role of the HOA and the balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. The HOA board, chastened by the experience, implemented a series of reforms designed to promote greater transparency and accountability. They revised the landscaping guidelines, making them more flexible and less restrictive. They established a mediation program to help resolve disputes between neighbors, and they created a community outreach program to promote communication and understanding. They also implemented a new policy requiring all HOA board members to undergo sensitivity training and conflict resolution workshops. The goal was to prevent future incidents of HOA-fueled aggression and to foster a more collaborative and respectful environment. The incident also led to a greater awareness of neighborly relations. Residents began to make an effort to get to know each other, to communicate more openly, and to resolve their differences peacefully. They organized neighborhood potlucks, block parties, and community service projects. They even started a neighborhood watch program to deter crime and promote safety. The incident also had a ripple effect beyond Willow Creek Estates. News of Brenda's garbage truck escapade spread throughout the region, sparking similar debates in other HOAs and communities. Many HOAs began to reevaluate their regulations and policies, seeking to strike a better balance between individual freedom and collective responsibility. Some HOAs even eliminated their landscaping guidelines altogether, allowing residents to express their creativity and individuality without fear of reprisal. Others implemented stricter enforcement mechanisms, seeking to prevent future incidents of HOA-fueled aggression. The garbage truck incident served as a wake-up call, a reminder that even the most well-intentioned organizations can become corrupted by power and that it is essential to safeguard individual freedoms and promote respectful communication. Years later, the residents of Willow Creek Estates still talked about the garbage truck incident. It had become a local legend, a story that was passed down from generation to generation. It was a reminder of the importance of neighborly relations, the dangers of unchecked power, and the absurdity of suburban life. And while the incident had caused a great deal of pain and suffering, it had also brought about positive change, fostering a greater sense of community and a deeper appreciation for individual freedom. The garbage truck incident, in its own strange and twisted way, had made Willow Creek Estates a better place to live. In the end, the story of Brenda Thompson and the garbage truck hijacking serves as a darkly humorous reminder of the absurdity of suburban life and the dangers of unchecked HOA power. It's a tale of petty grievances spiraling out of control, of good intentions gone awry, and of the importance of maintaining a sense of perspective. Even when faced with the most egregious landscaping infractions, it's easy to laugh at Brenda, to dismiss her as a crazy HOA Karen who got what she deserved. But her story also raises some important questions about the role of community associations and the potential for them to become instruments of oppression and conformity. It's a reminder that rules and regulations, while necessary for maintaining order, can also stifle creativity, individuality, and freedom of expression. It's a warning about the dangers of allowing petty grievances to fester and escalate, turning neighbors into enemies and communities into battlegrounds. And it's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the ability of individuals to overcome adversity, to forgive and forget, and to rebuild their lives even after experiencing the most traumatic events. David's story is a reminder that it's possible to move on from even the most absurd and outrageous situations, to find peace and fulfillment, and to create a better future. So, the next time you're tempted to complain about your neighbor's overgrown lawn or their unapproved Christmas decorations, take a moment to pause and reflect on the story of Brenda Thompson and the garbage truck hijacking. Remember that life is too short to sweat the small stuff, that neighborly relations are more important than perfect landscaping, and that a little bit of tolerance and understanding can go a long way. And if you're ever feeling tempted to hijack a garbage truck and dump trash on your neighbor's lawn, take a deep breath, count to 10, and remember that there are always better ways to resolve your disputes. Maybe try a friendly conversation, a mediation session, or even just a stiff drink. But whatever you do, avoid the garbage truck, because as Brenda Thompson learned the hard way, the consequences can be far more garbage than they're worth. And always check for security cameras. They might just save you from yourself, and maybe, just maybe, they'll save your neighbor's lawn too.